Good morning, Amanda Knox, or yes, well, it's
Good
afternoon.
evening. What time is it for you?
It's actually 5:30 here, but I think
Okay.
it's a lot earlier on the West
Yes.
Coast.
9:30 on our end. Yes.
The miracle of Zoom, and or as somebody called it, the permanent selfie of Zoom that we're
Oh
forced to
no.
endure. Um, So, and it's great to see you again. I've had the
Yeah.
pleasure of meeting Amanda when she was in Dublin on two occasions. So
And I'm sorry I'm not seeing you the upcoming one, but
yeah,
you have good reason to be where you are.
yes, indeed. So and just off the cuff, what's the atmosphere like in America now, or as you approach? I can't resist asking, as you approach midterm elections, or is
Uh
there or is that too left field?
no, it's not too left field. I'm the feeling is that nobody's feeling super positive about stuff here in the US these days. A lot of people are feeling like our our world is increasingly unstable and we're not doing anything really to restabilize it. So, I mean, it depends on who you ask. And I actually had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine who I was telling them I was going to be going abroad um, very soon. And they said, oh, it's so funny to like meet other Americans when you're abroad because you have to figure out what kind of American they are. Like you don't immediately know. You sort of have to feel each other out. And yeah, it's that there's this like constant feeling of, at least in the more liberal areas where I am in, uh, it's not feeling super hopeful. Uh, Unfortunately, no one's really feeling very hopeful these days.
Yeah, I suppose it's also a feeling that maybe people aren't talking to one another, that the camp, the respective camps are so divided that it's almost difficult for communication to occur on an
Yeah, and
individual
that's
level.
yeah, and that's something that I try to talk about when I give talks, and especially when I've talked about my book, like what does it really take to have a conversation with somebody whose entire worldview is both completely opposite yours and also happens to be wrong. Like that's it's a really difficult thing to do, and I think a lot of people are inclined to just avoid the conversation because they feel it's pointless. And in my experience, that doesn't I've always been a very hopeful person, and I've always been very curious to push back against the assumption that confrontation is necessarily a losing battle, and that you can have confrontation that isn't necessarily adversarial in nature.
Definitely, definitely, and I think it's very important, and it's vital for a healthy republic, for healthy politics to actually to accept that we're all not going to agree on everything, and that we have to sort of talk to people who we disagree with. And I suppose you've had obviously great experience of that, and have shown an amazing capacity to communicate with people who really acted quite awfully, and who said awful things to you and about you. And hopefully we'll get into that in relation to what we're going to talk about this evening, which is the Lucy Letby case.
Mm.
Just in case anyone doesn't know about Lucy Letby, she was an NHS nurse who was working in a sort of a neonatal ward in the Countess Hospital in Chester, England. And under her watch, something like 8 babies died in a hospital where there were only normally 3 deaths a year. So this anomaly caught the attention of some of the consultant doctors who alerted the NHS Trust about this, and pointed the finger of blame at Letby. And the trust were not amenable to this suggestion, or couldn't imagine this occurring. and it took some time before a police prosecution began. And then there was a criminal case brought against ultimately Letby and a trial which culminated in a guilty verdict in 2023. But many aspects of the case were are unsatisfactory. In particular, that I think that there was no expert evidence called on behalf of the defense in the trial, and many other aspects in relation to how the hospital operates. So, Amanda, how did you first become acquainted with the case?
So after she was convicted and the headlines were being put out there, this killer nurse, very sort of sensationalized headlines and a very sensationalized narrative that suddenly sort of broke the dam. So there was this sort of media, a lot of media couldn't discuss the case or couldn't get into the details of the case while it was unfolding during trial. As soon as the conviction happened and the dam broke, suddenly this like sweeping narrative of this serial killer nurse took over the public imagination. And when certain experts were finally able to look at the evidence that was presented at trial, they raised concerns. And the first experts who approached me were statisticians. And I think statisticians were the first ones to really raise the alarm, because one of the very suggestive pieces of evidence that was brought to trial was this list of all of the suspicious deaths and the list of all of the potential nursing staff that was on duty, and the only common denominator was Lucy Letby. Of course, that was after they had like the suggestion from the statisticians, though, was that that was not as suggestive as people thought it was. It felt like such a compelling piece of evidence, but that's only when you consider that they chose, of those like deaths that occurred, they only chose the ones to include in that list, the ones that where Lucy Letby was in fact on duty. So like any other deaths that might have been available were are first for review were not included in that list. And really it was meant to suggest a kind of certainty that was not merited. And also that even like very early on, the police hired a statistician to like talk about what are the chances that these many children would die and this nurse would be on duty. Like, what are the chances of that? And they basically wanted a statistician to like give them a number to make it look like, oh, that it'd be a one in bazillion chance that that was possible. And the original statistician that they reached out to said that that's not how this works. You can't just like predetermine what you want the statistics to mean. And so that was brought to me, and I'm not a statistician, right? Like I don't know. That sounds compelling. Like I've heard of things like the sharpshooter fallacy. Are you familiar with the sharpshooter fallacy?
No.
Where, okay, so the sharpshooter fallacy is, imagine some cowboy with a rifle who's shooting at the side of a barn. He just shoots randomly at the side of a barn, and then after he's done shooting, he goes up to the barn and circles the tightest cluster of shots and says, "Hey, look how accurate I am." So like that's where you sort of retroactively try to take random data and make it seem meaningful. And the statisticians that I talked to said that the how statistics were used in this case was very much like this kind of sharpshooter fallacy, that it wasn't proper statistics. Which, okay, interesting. Then there's the medical evidence, which itself, again, is, I'm not an expert of medical evidence, like I'm not an expert in DNA. And yet again, we're talking about something that is really complicated and and ambiguous in a lot of cases, and we are required to trust an expert to tell us how to interpret what is going on. And in these cases, I think something that really struck me was, when talking to people about the medical evidence in this case, so many people brought to my attention the fact that there was this like hyper focus on trying to find fault with like the nearest person, so Lucy Letby being the nearest person, without thinking of the bigger, broader picture. No one was looking to see like what about the pregnancies that of these babies, that like how were the mothers ill as they were about to give birth? Like how could that, like, we're talking about extremely fragile people. These are not like normal, patients. These are children that were born at like 25 weeks old. So already extremely fragile, underdeveloped. So many things can go wrong. And yes, the doctors say that a baby that seems stable doesn't just like all of a sudden collapse on its own. Like something is going on. But, and this is something that is true of female wrongful convictions, and this is, and the thing that sort of brings my attention to it is it's really, really common in cases where there is some sort of ambiguous or misunderstood factor that is leading to the deaths or the injury of children, and people automatically assume that the nearest caregiver is at fault, as opposed to assuming that there's some more complicated scenario. You see that time and again in women's cases of wrongful conviction, where like the vast majority of times that women get wrongly convicted, it's because there's some misunderstood something that's going on, either a medical issue. I knew a woman who was sent to death row because her child hadn't been diagnosed with a kidney disease and had died from a kidney disease, but they said that her child had gone into like arrest and she had tried to give it CPR, and they said that she had tried to crush her child to death. So like it was just like stuff like that happens where like something underlying is happening, and either the institution doesn't want to really further investigate or doesn't want to find itself at fault. Typically, there's like an institution that is seeking to find blame on an individual as opposed to taking responsibility for a number of factors that could be going wrong. And so that is in the back of my mind as I'm reviewing this case. And I think that something that struck me when I was reviewing the medical evidence is that there isn't consensus on what actually happened to these babies. No one actually saw Lucy Letby ever harm any of them.
I mean, isn't what didn't one of the consultants, Dr. Ravi Jayaram, didn't he claim, certainly in a TV interview, that he had walked in on Lucy Letby while she was observing a child in difficulty
That's right. So
breathing?
the closest thing that anyone has ever said to suggest that she was like caught red-handed is Dr. Ravi Jairam, who says that he walked in on Lucy Letby observing a baby that was in respiratory distress, and she wasn't reacting to it. And he says that he was, at trial, he said, I was in my office and I just got this sort of weird premonition something was wrong. So I go and I walk in, and there I see Lucy Letby just watching this baby die in front of me. And I intervene and I get this, like, I come in and I rescue this baby and I give it, air. But like it was ultimately unable to survive later on. And so it died later. And the thing that is controversial about that specific instance is that the way that he presented that story at trial was that he walked in on Lucy Letby and discovered her, sort of like caught her red-handed. But after the trial came out, emails of his came out that suggested a completely different story, that Lucy Letby had actually called him into the room to assist her with the baby. So it's a completely different scenario. And it's in his own email to his colleagues where he said, Lucy Letby called for help and I intervened. And like, so it's a completely different story, and it suggests a completely different kind of person. Is this somebody who's just lurking over a crib watching a baby suffocate to death? Or is it a nurse who's sort of caught in alarm and calls for help? Which is it? And this is all based upon the testimony of a doctor who whose own sort of bias in this case has come into question. His own, like, the reliability of his testimony is in question. One, because he's said different things at different times, but two, because even while the trial was taking place, this TV personality doctor was already making deals with production companies to tell the story from his perspective and make him out to be the hero who stopped a serial killer in a TV drama. So like before it's even like the dust is settled, he already has this story where he's the one who blew the whistle and ultimately stopped the serial killer, and he's presenting himself in a way that is, let's say, he's not an unbiased testimony in this case.
Sure. And while we're sort of getting into the evidence, I think most people would be drawn. That most people's attention would be drawn to the notes that Lucy Letby made in relation to her culpability,
Mm.
or her feelings in relation to the case. I mean, this was part of some therapy that she underwent after the deaths. Have you any insights into that? And are there
I
some
do.
parallels with your own case?
I'm so glad you asked me about that because I think it's the most, like, there's a lot to misunderstand in this case because of, it's statistics, it's medical evidence. There's different experts who are arguing different things. And, you know, like you have one expert saying one thing and another expert saying a completely different thing. So who are you supposed to believe? But ultimately, I think people can feel like it is common sense to say, oh, she wrote on a piece of paper, I'm evil, I did this. Okay, cut, this is, we don't really need to fully understand the medical or the statistical. We can read a piece of paper. We understand what this is. This is a confession. This is her, like, in her private space, really revealing what was ultimately going on inside of her. And that to me is the unfortunate part of this story, where people do not understand what it is like to be accused of a heinous crime out of nowhere. And that's where I can bring in some personal insight. And in fact, I didn't just bring in my own personal insight for the sake of this question, but I actually invited for my podcast two other women who I know very well, who are innocent, but who were accused of harming children and spent years, over a decade in prison each, for having committed crimes against children, only to have it overturned and revealed that nothing ever happened. So I spoke to these women, and without like sort of telling them what I was looking for, I was just asking, like, when you were going through this, did any part of you feel any kind of like self blame that people are calling you a monster? And like, because I remember when I was going through this, that I was thinking crazy thoughts that I never would think before. Like, oh, maybe in the universe, everyone is supposed to suffer a certain amount, and all of my suffering is just happening right now. And so maybe this is supposed to be happening. Or maybe this, like, or maybe the fact that, like, in my interrogation they confused me, maybe that was my fault. And one of my friends, she said, well, I remember when I was on trial, I just thought that maybe I was a bad person. Like, I know I didn't do this, but I thought, well, everyone hates me, it must mean that I'm just a bad person and that I deserve what is happening to me, even though I didn't do the thing that they say I did. So like, there's a lot of like, the experience of being accused of a heinous crime, especially against children, is so surreal and overwhelming that like it is a it challenges your sanity. And in her case, in Lucy's case, she was given specific therapeutic instructions, which were, you are being overwhelmed by horrible thoughts about everything that's happening right now. Just get them all out. Just get them out of you so they're not overwhelming in your head, just put them out, get them out of you. And that includes any thought whatsoever. And so she did. She wrote like post all crazy little post-it notes full of everything that could come to her mind, including I didn't do this. I'm innocent. But also, I'm evil. I did this because
But
this is
who can you just let us know who actually asked her to do this? Was this before the criminal prosecution began?
yeah, so this was something that she had been doing for a long time. In fact, it's something that her friends were able to actually bring forth that she like they had been instructed in the past to like if any sort of like anything is bothering you, just get it out of your like just write it all down. Just whatever's bothering you, write it down, get it out, and then you can sort of have the peace of mind to work through it and think through it clearly. And especially as she was going through the initial investigation that wasn't happening on the police like on the police's watch. It was an internal investigation to check in on these doctors' claims, and they ultimately ruled in her favor, found no wrongdoing. She was still in distress. Her career was at stake, and she was in distress. So she was writing out her thoughts to get them out, and that those thoughts were then cherry picked by the prosecution and claimed to be a confession. And I push back on that hard because it is not the case that only a guilty person would have a guilty thought. Time and again, research has shown that innocent people, especially when they are put under pressure and when they are accused, start to internalize feelings of guilt that they don't understand. And they, because we're social animals and we're interacting to how people are treating us. And so our understanding of ourself and our place in the world and what we may or may not have done is triggered and influenced by how people are interacting with us. And Lucy Letby was at the heart of an investigation that took place over a long period of time. And it was putting her entire life on the rails. And so she was in distress and was internalizing feelings of guilt. And like one of the things that so I push back on any sense that that is a definitive provable confession because I know from experience and I know from research that that is not the case. That innocent people can be made to feel guilty when they are not in fact guilty.
Yeah, I mean, you only have to read the novels of Dostoevsky to find people talking about how they're responsible for a crime. You know, Ivan uh, Karamazov talking about how he's guilty of killing his father for well, in this case, for planting ideas about killing his father, but
Right.
expressing animosity towards his father and to somebody and you know it's not it's yeah what somebody writes in that context where they're when no one else they don't think anybody else is reading it or listening to it is it's not necessarily what we mean or what we say or you know what we really mean and I can definitely agree with you on that but how was this evidence how was this allowed to go before a jury? I mean it wasn't it part of some sort of almost a medical treatment that she was receiving or a therapy that she was undergoing? Is that not it seems bizarre that should be that even before a jury because it would be any jury would just assume that somebody who wrote that had done it.
Well, absolutely. And I think that's what's really problematic is not understanding the context around those notes. They just confiscated the notes and then used them as evidence because they weren't, notes that she had written down in a therapist's office. She was at home writing these notes. And so they were technically, once her house was raided, available to be used as evidence. But people are not considering something that is a therapeutic tool that someone takes outside of the therapy room as protected in the same way that like a private conversation between you and your therapist might be protected.
And And would there be, just with your own case, what exactly happened? You were confronted by people accusing you of a crime, and
Hmm.
and eventually you broke down.
Hmm.
Is that, you were a young vulnerable woman, 20 years of age. Can you give us can you recall that
Yeah.
for us?
So yeah, sure. This is not a perfect parallel for what
Hmm.
Lucy was going through because she was not in an interrogation room as this was going on. This was her defending herself to her colleagues and eventually eventually defending herself to the police. But initially, the kind of distress and psychological trauma that she was put through was from her colleagues and from the prospect of losing her career, which she had worked so hard for, um, and being ostracized by her community. Like those were the initial things that triggered her sense of distress. For me, I, my roommate was killed out of nowhere. And before I even had time to process that, I was in the police office answering questions for hours a day and just anything I could possibly think of that might give them any sense of what could have happened to my roommate. Of course, I had no idea, but I'm thinking anybody who looked at her the wrong way, like whatever, I'm just putting myself out there and making myself available to the police officers who are calling me in for hours and hours of questioning a day. And ultimately, that culminated in an overnight interrogation where the police accused me of lying to them and lied to me and ultimately told me that everything I thought I remembered about the night that my roommate was murdered was not true, that I was traumatized from having witnessed the crime, and that I just needed to remember it for them to prove to them that I wasn't in cahoots with the murderer. And so they demanded, didn't just invite me, demanded that I remember something different than I thought I remembered. And with enough like provoking and suggestion, they they induced me to imagine that I had witnessed my boss, Patrick Lumumba, rape and murder my roommate. And I wasn't like I was this is the most confused and terrified I've ever been in my entire life because at a certain point I could not make sense of why they were so angry at me, why they were yelling at me, why they were hitting me. Like I was just all I was doing was trying to help the police and they were so angry and so sure of themselves and it caused me to question myself. It made me question what I knew to be real and I tried to imagine what they were asking me to remember, something that I could not remember. And I wasn't even able to really piece together a memory. I sort of had flashes of images that were sort of collages of different memories, and sort of tried to jam them into what made sense to them. And the ultimate sort of statement that they wrote down and had me sign was a very confused statement that was full of, I'm confused, I don't know what's real. And yet that was treated as evidence. And, hours later, I recanted, but they wouldn't hear of it. They told me that my true memories would come back in time and they sent me off to prison. And that, I mean, to this day, I remain convicted based upon that experience of being put through psychological torture by people who were abusing and lying to me, and I had, no legal recourse. I was denied an attorney. I was denied, uh, you know, uh, it was a hugely traumatic experience that was utterly illegal, um, and yet I remain so much of the case about me remains controversial because so many people have trouble imagining that an innocent person could ever conceivably think guilty thoughts or imagine alternate realities in which they could be potentially involved in a crime that they didn't commit at all. And that to me is a bias that people have, imagining that innocent people only behave a certain way, when in fact, time and again, history has shown and research has shown that innocent people are actually quite psychologically vulnerable to suggestion when they are put on the spot and when they are put into situations that are,
Tortured, essentially,
yeah, yes.
psychologically tortured.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, and no one knows how they would react. No one can know how they would react because, and fortunately, very few people are, subjected to that experience. Um, and given your perspective, I'm just wondering, and your experience, would you be disposed, to think that someone like Lucy Letby would be innocent? Does that make you biased in her favor?
Sure. I think that that's an idea worth taking very seriously. I am somebody who's really informed about how women are wrongly convicted. And this specific case has a lot of the hallmarks of how that takes place. And there are cases that are echoes of this case that have happened before, of nurses who were convicted of hurting children based on false statistical evidence that later came to be shown that was not accurate. Lucia DeBerk's case, we talk about similar cases in the podcast of women who are wrongly accused, specifically nurses. And so I am aware of that history. I'm aware of my own history. I I can see how things are misinterpreted, and I think that I am inclined to give the benefit of the doubt and give reasonable doubt in cases where, and I think that that's technically what our legal system should be doing as well, but I am inclined to unless there is definitive proof of guilt, assume innocence. And I think what's interesting about this case is that, well, in the past, I have been burned before because of that. I made the mistake of advocating for someone who I believed was innocent based upon a not thorough examination of the DNA evidence. And when it was brought to my attention that I had not considered the DNA evidence fully and I did a fuller look at it and I realized I was wrong, I went out there and I did a big mea culpa in the Atlantic where I wrote about having realized that someone that I had advocated for was actually guilty. And in this case, I do take that history with me as someone who has made that mistake in the past. And that's why in this case, I really sought out to try to understand every single piece of evidence. And I think that, and, speaking to medical experts and statistical experts and all of that, and there is a level of trust that we all have to put into the experts that we talk to. But I think ultimately what I came away with is that, like so many other cases, this is not a case where there is definitive proof of innocence. But also, this is not a case where there is definitive proof of guilt. And that is where society then has to ask themselves, well, where do we fall? Where do we land? What matters to us? This is a highly emotionally charged case. And are we the kind of society that is comfortable with finding fault in an individual that we are not 100% certain about? Or do we fall in the reasonable doubt camp?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a very difficult question. I suppose the standard of proof, obviously, in a criminal trial is beyond reasonable doubt, which is a high threshold to meet. Um, and I suppose the reality is probably otherwise, so that people, if they're put before a jury by the police, most people believe that they're guilty.
Yeah.
So and yet the police have been shown to be corrupt in some countries, in many countries, uh, and there are many people who have been exonerated and for very good reasons. But I suppose I'm interested. Just I suppose there's an intuitive kind of response. Is there to the way somebody acts, or we've all seen probably the video of Lucy Letby being arrested, and the way she interacts with her cats and her whole demeanor is just kind of it's just very soft. And I suppose some people would kind of look behind the veil of some kind of evil, and others would kind of say, well, this is just a kind of a very gentle nurse. How do you like? Do you have that, or can you separate your kind of intuitive response from the kind of rational, kind of analytical response to a case?
Well, I think that the most important thing to remember is that we as humans are inclined to see what we want to see. And to give, that's a great example of, we have footage of Lucy Letby being arrested. And those who are inclined to believe in her guilt see her gentle, mild demeanor to be a sign of how cunning and manipulative she is. Because look, here she's acting so sweet and kind when, she's being brought in for murder. And and then those who are inclined to believe in her innocence are like, she's she's just a soft, mild-mannered person. Like that this what do you, why are you so I think that what's really interesting to me is how ultimately why anyone acts the way they do uh, is something that we don't always have full and utter access to. And pretending that we are able to, just by looking at them and having a gut feeling about it, determine the truth behind the demeanor is a really risky and uh, faulty thing to do. Like, we're inclined to make mistakes based upon confirmation bias. And this is something that's very similar to my own case where, people look at me getting like hugged and kissed by my boyfriend outside of a crime scene and think, look at her. She's so turned on by the murder. She can't help but make out with people. And another person looks at that and goes, she looks like a deer in headlights and her boyfriend's just trying to like calm her down, like give her some comfort. You'll see what you want to see. And that's what's so dangerous about these cases where people can interpret the same facts in completely different ways based upon their already predetermined convictions.
Yeah, I suppose, just in relation to Lucy Letby, there's no, I mean, you would ordinarily, if there's a serial killer, there's some kind of motive, so was it Harold Shipman was kind of stealing money,
A lot of times there's a
there
sexual motive,
sexual
sure. Yeah.
motive, or somebody has a record of doing things of this nature before, like,
There's a
the
ratcheting up of like,
yeah,
aggressive
some.
behavior. Yeah.
But we haven't heard any stories in relation to Lucy Letby being a kind of somebody who drowns cats or pulls
Yeah.
wings off insects, or whatever it is that kind of is the starter, that precedes the main course of actual murder.
Hmm.
Um, it
Yeah,
just it does.
there's no history of escalation. Yeah, it's really troubling to me when the story that comes out is, here's a woman with no history of violence, no history of mental illness, and no motive is suddenly the greatest serial killer in UK history. Like, that to me is reason for pause because, as you said, I don't think serial killers just come out of nowhere. And I think there's an inclination when finding fault in women to say, oh, well, they were just, going along until one day they snapped. You hear, especially in the US, you hear like, oh, snapped. The woman just one day was totally fine and then turned into a monster overnight. And I think that that is a myth. I think that anyone who would be like exhibiting the kind of antisocial behavior required to to kill multiple innocent, fragile human beings there would have been some signs of antisocial behavior. And everyone who has been asked to speak about her behavior or her personality has always talked about how she was a normal, social, regular person. And again, that requires us to believe that this manipulative psychopath of a person was hiding in plain sight. Nobody saw her coming. And then just one day out of the blue decided to be a psychopath. And I just find the probability of that, let's talk statistics. The probability of that is, I would love some statistician to give me insight on that.
I suppose also there's the the nature of a criminal trial. It's asking for, is this person innocent or guilty? And there's no, you know, question of whether, was she competent?
Mm.
Perhaps, maybe she, maybe perhaps her, she perhaps that was a problem that was overlooked. That didn't form any part of the trial. I don't think there's any
Yeah.
suggestion that she was incompetent, but was it bad clinical management? Did she display some characteristics, that maybe led to children dying under her watch? Or the question then of diminished responsibility or insanity that didn't arise either, which is also quite strange. It just seemed like a criminal trial in these circumstances was quite inappropriate because really, like, there's just like in the absence of any forensic evidence, what you're dealing with is such uncertainty.
Hmm.
Um, to ask a kind of binary question of innocent or guilty just seemed really inappropriate.
I mean, the one definitive thing that they knew was that children were dying and that they were dying at a rate that was unusual. And I think that can't go like that. Absolutely is the 100%, like we know for a fact that children were dying at a rate that they shouldn't have at this hospital. Now, do we know why or how definitively? I don't think so. But I think that people are right to be angry and concerned when babies are dying that shouldn't be dying. How we determine and how we react to that is ultimately really telling and important. And I think that's the really big un unanswered question here is, have we done what we need to do in order to prevent that from happening again? And a lot of people point to the fact that since Lucy was taken out of the hospital, then, babies aren't dying anymore. And they say, look, isn't that definitive proof that it was her? But at the same time, that she was taken off the hospital, like after she was no longer working in the neonatal unit was downgraded, and so it wasn't allowed to take the same kind of fragile babies that they were taking before. And so, what is the cause of the fewer deaths that then were coming after she was gone? Like I think that there is alternate explanations for what could have been going on that were not fully explored at trial, and specifically because there were no medical experts for the defense during the trial. Like there have been medical experts that have come out since the trial who have argued that the prosecution's medical expert was completely misinterpreting evidence, and even the medical expert for the prosecution has even changed his mind since the trial about how he thinks one of the babies died. So like even that, they can't, like, he as a reliable source of what definitively happened to these babies, I think is very questionable, and I think it's much more ambiguous than anyone is really considering.
Yeah, I think the the kind of medical expert who appears in prosecution cases, such as this Welsh doctor Evans, it seems that they are kind of used because they're going to be very persuasive in securing a prosecution as opposed to the court being informed on what happened. And in an adversarial system, when you have scientific evidence being deployed like that, it's not, it ceases to be scientific. It becomes sort of just adversarial material. You talked about the sharpshooter and all of that, and it seems that forensic evidence, it works in the same way,
Hmm.
and it does point to a larger problem. But let's go back a bit to the way the sort of the scapegoat emerges and the mechanism of the scapegoat and how this sort of witch or whatever you want to call the accused in this case is portrayed in the media. You in your podcast series you spoke about how the British media manipulated evidence in your own case
Hmm.
and that you saw a similar pattern in Lucy's case. Can you expand on this for our listeners?
Yeah, so this again isn't a perfect parallel because the rules about media talking about evidence during a trial are different in Italy than they are in the UK. So in my case, there was just no regulations whatsoever. The media was allowed to publish anything and everything about the evidence, about the testimonies, about everything as the investigation was unfolding. And so there was no filter between what the jury had access to in court versus what they had in the media. Everyone was sort of armchair detectoring as the case was unfolding. And by the time I even saw my first court date for my own trial, I was already, 2 years in to a huge story that had sort of taken over the public imagination and that everyone already felt like they had an opinion about. And in Lucy's case, there were restrictions on what was allowed to be talked about in the case during the trial. But immediately,
And importantly, I think these restrictions re-emerged, didn't they, when there was
yes.
another charge laid against her?
Yes. So this is where it's actually a little more of a parallel. So, really interestingly, these restrictions, I think, made sense up until her conviction. And then all of a sudden, there was a tidal wave of she's guilty, she's a serial killer, she's a monster. But then, before any kind of counter narrative or counter, you know, idea could be brought forth into the public imagination, restrictions were locked down again because the police decided to retry her on a case where she was found not guilty. Like they couldn't determine whether or not she was guilty of killing baby K. And so suddenly there is a narrative that is out there that is in the media, but the restrictions make it impossible to question it, to examine it closely. So even if there were journalists, and there were plenty of journalists who were like, we should take a closer look at this case and report on it, they couldn't because there were restrictions in place. And so it effectively was there is one narrative, the prosecution and the police's narrative that is out there, and that is the only narrative that can exist until the other trial was able to unfold. And it was only once, so like months and months go by where everyone is sort of just takes in this story of the serial killer nurse and doesn't question it. And I think what was really interesting is when I came into the picture, it was during these restrictions. And I started poking around and asking around, like, how are people thinking about this? And I was shocked to like talk to journalists in the UK and, you know, real BBC journalists who are talking about how this case is untouchable, not just because of the restrictions, but because of the societal bias against anyone who was inclined to question the evidence in the case. People who were questioning at all her guilt were considered crackpot conspiracy theorists who only wanted to make the families of the victims suffer. And to me, that is a huge red flag when you are not allowed to do proper research and reporting and investigation of a case on the basis of it's too it's too emotional. Like that to me is I think at the heart of a lot of the controversies around true crime and the way that it is reported. I do think that certain cases are sensationalized and often not in the interests of the victims or of the truth. But like if there is only one if there are legitimate reasons for there to be alternate explanations or questions into a case, they absolutely should be questioned and investigated and reported. And I don't think any journalist or testimony or expert should feel intimidated to come forward. People talking about how, a lot of nurses were feeling really concerned about this case, but felt like if they came forward to talk about it, they would lose their jobs or they would lose their friends, they would lose their standing in society. Everyone just had to sort of fall in line with the narrative that unfolded immediately after her conviction. And, you know, that to me is where I put a little bit my foot down and I'm like, well, you know what? I'm already controversial in the UK, so I might as well take it on.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the phrase the appalling vista. I don't know if
Mm,
you're familiar with that from Lord Devlin in the case of the Birmingham Six, who thought it would be an appalling vista if it was shown that the police and the prosecution services had colluded to frame innocent men. And I think that's probably where the resistance to dissent comes from. That people, if you question the basis of that conviction, you're questioning the authority of senior doctors, you're questioning the authority of the police, the Crown Prosecution Service, the
yep.
judiciary, the whole edifice of the state is called into question when you once you start to if you start pointing the finger. And
Hmm.
in a small society, in Britain, Britain isn't such an enormous country, particularly, the intelligentsia, the media. It's, people know one another, and just
Hmm.
to speak out becomes very difficult. And I think we see that a lot in the world today. And and this case, who knows what happened, and we'll never know because there simply isn't evidence. No,
Yeah.
the prosecution doesn't have evidence. You know, we don't, so we'll never know exactly what happened or why there was a spike in deaths in a particular hospital. But the sense that we can't speak out, that's what's disturbing, I think,
Yeah.
uh, to any journalist observing this from afar. And it's great that you did get involved. But I'm wondering, is there something particularly ghoulish in the way the British media portrays those assumed to be murderers, or does the Italian media act in a similar fashion? And what about the US? Are murder cases given such prominence there?
I mean, yes, I think that that's kind of a universal thing where I mean, personally, I feel like there's something very special about the British media where it seems to almost enjoy it. Like there's like this sort of perverse enjoyment of just raking an accused murderer across the coals. There's almost a glee in it, but I don't think that that's, you know, only a British media thing. I think the similar things are happening were happening to me in Italy, and I think that you could say uh, similar things to how people are portrayed in U.S. media. I think that when you are given license to vilify, it's a very eye-catching and profitable way to tell the news. I think it's immediate because it's so controversial and because it's so eye-catching and outrageous, it just does the thing that news is trying to do, which is capture attention. And so I think that if you look at media as the business of capturing attention, focusing on controversial murder cases, scandalous murder cases, is effective business. And as opposed to focusing on what's happening in your local city council, which actually probably affects more people. But, it's a business. And so business does what business does. It's going to produce a product that is going to ultimately bring in the attention and the money that comes with that attention to meet the bottom line.
And if you're a corrupt political regime, as in maybe Berlusconi's government in Italy, and you have a very high-profile murder case that everybody is talking about every hour of the day on
They're not
their
talking about
media,
you.
on the media you control, and everybody's got a strong opinion one way or the other, it does it does definitely serve a purpose. I
Hmm.
suppose in the United States there might be more of a kind of racial element to it. Is that
Yeah,
it's not so much about vilifying the individual or this kind of eccentric character as in the classic English murder story. Uh,
although, Epstein is the name of the day here in the US. And so there's a lot of people are arguing that like potentially all of this conversation around Jeffrey Epstein and the elite pedophiles is once again a distraction technique from more closely observing and being skeptical of what the government is doing at this time. So
Well,
there's
that's an interesting perspective. I thought the Epstein case was kind of all about how people in power were sort of amusing themselves and making deals on the sideline.
right.
Um,
But in the meantime, we're talking about on a private island as opposed to what is actually happening in DC.
that's true. Um, just finally, Amanda, I mean, you've obviously gone through a lot in your own trial, and false conviction, but you also had a very difficult experience with your first child. Is it your first child or your second child?
My
And so
first, yeah.
your first child, and so you can sort of identify with some of the real trauma that people experienced, in relation to losing their own children. What goes through a woman's mind when they're and a parent's mind when they're confronting that awful eventuality. So
Yeah.
maybe did that help you understand this case a little better?
It definitely, I think, made me able to better appreciate the stakes of this story because once again, like 100% without question, there were babies that were dying and probably should not have been dying. And that is a terrifying, horrifying reality. And in my own situation, I, my first daughter, my first child was born, and it was an immediate medical emergency. And I didn't know what was wrong, but I was informed that my child was potentially very, very, very sick, and wouldn't be it. If it survived, it wouldn't be a normal baby. And so I spent the first 6 months of my daughter's life in a horrible state of limbo, not knowing, crying almost every day, breastfeeding my child and weeping. And every time she fell asleep and like twitched in her sleep, worrying that it was some sort of catastrophic seizure. Like there's so, I think it really solidified for me how fragile a life is, especially a new life, how much, you know, all the experts in the world can think they know, but also they might not know. Like ultimately, my daughter was fine. And what they thought was the signs of a debilitating disease were not. And they don't know what they are. It's just like a skin condition that she has. But it's not, it doesn't mean that she doesn't have all of her brain or that she's going to go blind or that her kidneys are going to fail. Like I was given a list of catastrophic events that were in store for my child at her birth that did not pan out, but that there is that state of uncertainty and I remember in those early stages I thought, was this my fault? Like, was I somehow sick in a way that I didn't know and I had passed that on to my daughter? So like just like the stakes, the sense of guilt, the sense of uncertainty that I've experienced in my own life as a parent have helped me to appreciate the stakes of this story and understand truly how emotional it is. Um,
I suppose what I'm interested in, I suppose, is the relationship you might have with the doctors and nurses who you depend on in that situation, who you're
mm,
100%, I suppose, reliant on, to take care of your child. And,
yeah.
the thought that they could, well, even that they would be negligent,
Hmm.
would be just absolutely shocking.
Yeah. And I was
Uh,
really grateful that I was not in a situation where I was in a hospital facing staffing shortages like the Countess of Chester was. I had a nurse coming in and informing me and helping me understand like I was never just left alone or abandoned. And unfortunately, like some hospitals are not in the same kind of condition. And you're not going to be able to receive that same quality of care, not because the nurses don't care and aren't working hard, but just because there aren't enough of them or they're not specialized enough in order to meet your specific needs. So I think that in that way, again, tragedies can happen not because of some kind of psychopath that is in hidden in the midst, but because a million little things can go wrong and people are just not equipped to handle them.
just final question. Have you had any contact with Lucy Letby? Have you been able to reach out to her? Has she reached out to you, or
I've reached out to her personally. I've reached out to her family. I have not received word back, but I am in contact with her attorney.
okay? Well, thanks, Amanda. That was really great. And we will look forward to hearing for more of your podcast series, and hopefully we can talk again. So,
That'd be great.
yeah,
Thanks,
okay.
Frank.
Thank you, Amanda.